So the session, India, the power of fiction across borders and of translations, with Shashi Tharoor, Suki Kim, Tishani Doshi, and Vivek Shanbag in conversation with Erika Koto. The session is presented by Litro Magazine.
Look at all these good people who've given up their lunch for literature.
It is amazing.
Yeah, it works.
Hello.
Sound? Moderator's sound is not there.
Hello.
Hello. Thank you, everyone. Look, this is amazing. Every year it's just dumbfounding. So we're here this afternoon to talk about translation and fiction and its powers to cross borders. In 2016, Litro magazine embarked on an adventure to twice a year visit India. 2016, along with my friend Shashi on my right, we looked at the diaspora and writers writing outside of India. This year, we've turned the pages to translating writers and stories from the lesser-known parts of India. And it's really the inspiration for this afternoon's conversation about translations and its powers across borders. It's such an honor to be joined by Tishani Doshi on my left, Shashi Tharoor on my right, Suki Kim, and Vivek Shanbag. The afternoon, I'm going to ask a series of questions, 7 or 8. I'm going to keep my questions really short, because I'm sure you all want to hear from the writers, poets, and dancers, in some cases, that have joined us. And then afterwards, Tishani will close with a reading of one of her poems. And then if we have enough time, we'll open up the floor for you lovely people to ask us some questions. So I guess really to start the conversation would be to turn the mic to Suki. And at the moment, walls are going up and connections are being broken, Trump, Brexit. There's a lot of insular thinking as well. And really the question to Suki, if we start from right to left, is what's the place these days for fiction in general at a time like this, and what power does fiction have to resist these political trends, any or none at all? Suki.
Well, I mean, it's an interesting time that we are living in. I live in New York City. I am an American writer, but I grew up in South Korea, and I cover North Korea for my nonfiction and investigative journalism. In fiction, I've covered, my novel was actually about being an ethnic minority and what it means as an immigrant, which, these questions are huge questions now, especially in this time under Trump era. So I think that, this really does, as in a way, difficult for fiction writers because all the nuance can get really didactic in some way, but it also gives you a lot of topics to cover and also to champion through your work because no matter what you say, you cannot help being political. I found that with my actually first novel, being a literary writer, immediately I was pegged as sort of an activist writer. And it's hard when you're a fiction writer, you just want to write words and language. But in this era, I think that your meanings get very bigger and bigger. Like recently, actually, Vanity Fair picked my novel as one of the 5 novels that one must read about to understand South Korea, but I'm actually an American writer. So immediately I thought, why do they not want to give me a credit as an American? Why, to them, I'm a foreigner. And I've been living in America for decades, and I publish in America foremost. So these questions become, whether you want it or not, political.
And the same to you, Shashi, and it's a question, being a politician as well, and being in the literary world, how do you feel your writing touches on politics? And I guess
Well, in my case, it's a little different because though the 4 of my first 5 books were fiction, my last 12 have all been non-fiction. So I've moved away from the world of fiction, not so much as some sort of ideological choice in the issue that you and Suki have been discussing, but rather simply because of the process of creativity involved. That I find that with both kinds of writing, of course, for me with my full-time work, it's always a struggle to find the time. But with fiction, you don't just need time, you need a space inside your head to create an alternative universe, to populate it with characters, with episodes, with snatches of dialogue that are as real to you as those of the people you're encountering in your daily life. And that I find is simply less feasible in the kind of life I'm leading. It's been true in the last years of my UN career, and it's been true since I came into Indian politics. And the other challenge is, of course, that if the nature of your life means interruptions of your writing, I find non-fiction is usually something you can recover, but fiction you can't, because with fiction you create this illusory world, like this glass palace, as it were, and if it keeps getting shattered, you can't stick the pieces of glass together again, over and over again. So you're writing a non-fiction argument, you get called off to go and do something else for weeks on end, you can come back, reread what you were writing, re-enter your train of thought, and pick up where you left off. With fiction, that isn't possible. So for me, fiction at the moment has been relegated to a backseat by my life. It doesn't mean that I wouldn't love to write fiction. It doesn't mean I don't get fan letters and messages every time I bring out a book saying, when's your next novel coming? And the truth is there hasn't been a novel for 16 and a half years. So it is a challenge. And I would like, maybe one day the voters will return me to the world of literature. But till then, I'm out there trying to fight a good fight on the political field. And this aspect of my writing takes a back seat. I find I'm able to advance my beliefs and ideas through nonfiction, which I would have in the past tried to use fiction as a vehicle to advance.
And the same to you, Tishani.
It's very interesting. I think the reasons why we write, or the impulses for what causes this sort of creative endeavor of either poetry or fiction. And when it comes to politics, I always try to keep it kind of separate in a way. And maybe 5 or 6 years ago, I actually left the city of Madras or Chennai to live down the coast, a place where I don't get any mail, I don't receive any newspaper, and I have to stand on a wall to find 3G on my telephone, because I was so fed up of the news and so fed up of living in the world. And I thought, I want to be the ostrich in the sand. I want to just be in this space where I can have this freedom and this actual room to think and to think about the things that I care about. But the weird thing is that ever since I moved there, my work has become more political. And I think that my new book, which is called Girls Are Coming Out of the Woods, which I'll read from, is far more political than my previous work. And so I think there's no running away from politics entering into the arena of fiction and poetry. But certainly we want to keep a difference between propaganda and real political propaganda and the act of literature, which are two different things.
Vivek, I'll ask you to you.
Yeah, I feel a writer today, not today, as any time in the past, has to be political. There is no choice. But I feel a writer must not play party politics. The politics of a writer is of a different kind, and it is very intense. It is something that has the ability to peep into the future. The example is Orwell's 1984. And the examples are many great works of the past which we still find relevant today. The other thing is, when you open a book, you are into another world. And that is something which I think we lack today, and which is why there is so much of intolerance. If you read a lot of literature, a lot of fiction, I think you appreciate the world better. And if you know the other world, you are more tolerant, you are more loving of that world. So I think the politics is inevitable. And I don't mean to say protest literature or activism, but politics of a kind which gets into the depth of our life, that I think is most important today.
Do you think that fiction in itself, poetry, in your case, Tishani, can it be a form of resistance in terms of writing and pushing against the current trend, the way the politics is going? Can fiction be a form of resistance in itself, or poetry?
Well, because I think that, and I think good writing does, whether poetry or fiction or literary journalism. I mean, all these, when you create an incredible world that can move someone else's, the reader's mind, then I think that right away it is an act of is some sort of political or resistance, and you basically can convince someone to think a certain way. I mean, I think that that's a huge magic and power that you have. And especially, we're talking about a translated work. What that means is that readers sitting here in Jaipur can somehow transport themselves to South Korea or London or all these other parts of the world and identify and fall in love with these characters who really come from a different part of the world from you, with different cultures. And I think that, I mean, ultimately that's the magic, isn't it? Of basically a political resistance in some way?
No, I agree. I was going to say, yesterday I was here, and I apologize, I can't remember who the gentleman's name was, but he made a comment in terms of writing fiction, being empathetic and inspiring empathy, but not empathy in a sense that although you understand where the other person's coming from, you don't necessarily agree with them. So maybe that's the power that you're saying in terms of writing can do.
Yeah.
Shashi.
But you know, I would just say, when you ask, can fiction contribute to the ideas of resistance, the answer is of course, because some of the great fiction of the 20th century was produced in repressive polities in which writers were not given the freedom to write, whether the Soviet Union, some of the East European dictatorships, some of the Latin American dictatorships when they were dictatorships. That famous metaphor of Kurt Vonnegut's, that the writer's role in these societies is like the parrot that's sent down in a cage. When you're starting a new coal mine or a gold mine, you send a bird down in a cage to the bottom of the mine. If the bird suffocates, chokes to death, just unable to breathe, or comes back up spluttering and gasping for air, then you know there isn't enough oxygen down below and it's not safe to send the miners down. And his metaphor was that writers, including of fiction, particularly of fiction, one might argue, are like the bird in the cage. They're actually plumbing the depths of the society, and their gasps of suffocation are what alert the rest of the society that there is a certain oxygen missing. That act of resistance is fundamental.
That's such a great metaphor. And Tishani, too.
Yes, I mean, as a poet, you know, you have a lot of questions about what the point of poetry is. Particularly, I'm an English language poet in India, and I think it's quite a marginal activity, and you don't get the sense of, well, let's say we wouldn't have this crowd, for instance, you know. And I think there's a lot of questioning about what you do, but essentially there's also this magic of literature, which is that the poem finds the audience, or the novel finds the audience, and it is an act of resistance. And what I've been writing about a lot recently is about gender violence, and I think there's this sense of, what do we do with our ghosts? What do we do with all these murdered women? How do we bring them back in some way? It's impossible, but in a poem somehow there is a way to at least give voice to that. And I see poetry as giving voice, and I see that essentially as an act of resistance. And also I think writing poetry is an act of great optimism.
And for you, Vivek?
I think literature drives you to look at the specifics, which I think is very important. Because if you look at anything at a macro level, for example, the certain political parties would like you to look at certain sect of people, like you can say Muslims, you can say Dalits, but a literature, a fiction especially, takes you to the specifics, then you start looking at people, the individual, the story of that individual and the details of their life. It really is a way by which you can be more, you can have more empathy, you can connect with people. So these two are the forces, while literature draws you to look at the specifics. And there is another one which is trying to generalize it, right? So I think there is a lot of, literature has enormous power to bring this, protest. And the great example is Dalit literature in India. If you look at the history of Dalit literature, it has always been so powerful because the stories of Dalits, something which we were never heard of and which we had just brushed aside, when it came to fore and those details stunned the literary world. And we felt that there is something which is lacking in our understanding of the world. And that I think is a great step forward.
No, that's a very good point, Vivek. And what's interesting, if I may, I just want to ask my guest here this afternoon just a question on translation. This is the latest edition of the title Translating India that Shashi and I are working on, and Vivek contributed to the edition. And what I want to ask, and I'm sure my guests this afternoon, their works have been translated all over the world, is really what is in terms of the usefulness of translation, what is gained when your work is translated and connected with other people around the world?
Well, I think what's gained is a new audience. I mean, let's be very honest that there's that famous Italian line, I think, traditore, traduttore, which is that to translate is to betray. You cannot ever translate entirely accurately because the nuances, the music of the words in one language can never be identically replicated in another. Words are freighted with all sorts of meanings. There is the literal meaning of the word. There is the contextual meaning of the word. There is the usage of the word, whether it implies informality, superiority, obscurity, colloquialism, whatever. Then there is the cultural baggage that comes with the word, how it's used, in what particular society it's used, and so on. Now, you can't render all of that into a translation, and some translators are better than others. I think the famous example is supposed to be of Gregory Rabassa, whose translations of Garcia Marquez into English were so good that some people said they were better than the original. I don't read Spanish, so it's not my judgment. But you have to essentially get into the head of the writer and then essentially write as well as he or she does. That gets very difficult with poetry. That even gets difficult with some kinds of fiction. Play on words is usually a big victim. And having seen some of the translations of my books into languages that I know but could not myself have written in, I can already spot some of the mistakes. And then I tell myself, am I going to focus on the mistakes, or am I just going to be grateful that there are some people reading me in French or Italian or Malayalam or Bengali for that matter, who would not otherwise have read me if my book was only in English? And I tell myself, no, I think the audience is, because what, you're right to be read, all of us. I think those of us who pretend we write only for our literary muse are not being entirely honest. If you want to publish, that means you want to be read. And if you're read by as wide a readership as possible, then your ideas, your thoughts, the efforts you made, that creative channeling you've done is reaching more people. So I'm all for translation.
Those are really good comments. And it's quite interesting is the idea is when someone reads War and Peace, they think they're reading the original War and Peace. But what you're actually reading, if anyone has read it, I don't think I've managed to start from beginning to end.
I did as a kid, actually.
You did? Okay. I got close to the end. But I think what you don't really understand is you're reading someone else's translation of War and Peace. And I can't remember who it was that said, maybe it was Nabokov, but he said, better for a translated work to have some mistakes, going back to your point, than a non-translated work, because that's the effort of getting the book out. And this, your point, sorry, Tishani.
No, your mic. Yeah.
The point that Shashi was making earlier, and what's quite interesting in what we were just talking about, is it's quite timely in terms of Smithgate. I think it's what the New Yorker have called in terms of the translation of the vegetarian and the elements of mistakes that went into that. And as a poet, you've had your
Yeah.
fiction work done as well.
Yeah.
Just really to get your comments on
No,
that.
it's a very curious thing because it always feels that poetry is sort of less translatable than other things somehow because it's dealing with evanescent, with so many spaces and things that are very hard to grasp. But I really love. There's a Welsh poet, R.S. Thomas, who said that translation it's like kissing through a handkerchief, and it's this sense of coming close enough. Not quite close, but it's better to kiss through a handkerchief than not at all, I think. So, yes.
The one writer here in India who actually is known to English language readers because of translation is Vivek.
And I was going to go to Vivek because interestingly, yesterday we had a very interesting conversation, although it was quite shorter than we wanted. And you were talking about the magazine you edited in Canada in terms of bringing Canadian Indian writers or Indian Canadian writers, however they would like to be acknowledged. And your comment, an interesting comment that you made was you felt very arrogant because you thought you knew all the works of your fellow comrades, but you hadn't. Do you want to talk a little bit more about that comment?
Yeah, we generally, when we talk about literature in Indian languages, we say that it's a gold mine. But you don't get gold biscuits in gold mine. You only get ore. You need to really put that hard work of, to get 1 gram of gold, you have to process 1 ton of ore. So that is something we always forget. I think there is a lot of merit in looking at these languages and putting that effort to really understand, what are those gems there and bring that into other languages, not just in English, but in other Indian languages as well.
And a comment that I'd make, and I'm going to ask all my guests this afternoon, and I'll start with you, Vivek, since I'm turning your direction. I mean, Canada is a hectic country. Toronto is a hectic city. Shashi's MP in a hectic city, and your world is constantly moving, from politics to writing to various festivals, and Suki's New York. And really, it's a point that Tishani made earlier in terms of how do you slow down, how do you stop your environment from being so chaotic that you get a moment in time to be creative and to thought, stand still, slow down, and think. And Vivek, since your world is on translation, so the creativity there and the time to slow down is more necessary. Do you want to start with the question?
Yes. See, there is another. Every writer has to have an inner world, and that is very important. It's not about how hectic a life we lead. Like some time back, Shashi was talking about writing fiction and non-fiction. It's not the external hecticness or a busyness that really matters. As long as you have that space in your mind, then that I would call the slowness that you are referring to. And if you have that space, then I think you are there. And if you don't have that space, it doesn't matter whether you are busy or not busy. And that world is something different, which is the writer's inner life. It's the inner world.
But do you, like Tishani, sort of go off into the wilderness and have to sort of climb peaks to get 3G, or do you embrace technology and social media and everything else that goes with it?
Yeah, I think, again, we are talking about two different things. I mean, external world, all of us are busy with doing 1,000 things, but that doesn't matter. That really doesn't matter because, again, what do you consider, first thing in what is most priority for you? What is the first thing in your heart? That's what matters. For me, it is literature. So I make sure that there is time for reading, time for writing, time for doing everything else.
This is a very important point Vivek's making, because I had 30 years ago, a conversation with Mario Vargas Llosa, because I was working at the UN and struggling to find time to write my fiction. And I said, how did you do it as a young man? And he said, I just took up professions which didn't engage me that much, that didn't demand that much of me, so I was able to focus on my writing. And I said, what professions were those? And he said, teaching and journalism. And I thought, what? Here are two professions that I would think demand a great deal out of it. And so I think the answer And it's coming through implicitly in what Vivek said. It's not so much what your profession is, but how much importance you give it. And if he says he puts writing first because it's the first thing in his heart, I tell him I can't afford to do that because as a politician elected to go back to the voters every day, I have to put them first. There is no choice. It may be that my writing is really first in my heart, but in my life, my voters have to be first. I'm being very blunt about it. So for you to say that busyness is irrelevant, not true. It does influence, it does affect the writer. And, you know, I was a writer long before I was a politician, and I'll probably be a writer long after I'm a politician. I always joke that, you know, I'm already a former minister. One day I'll be a former MP. I don't intend ever to be a former writer. So at some point there'll be a chance to come back to getting away from the busyness.
And Suki, do you have a process that
Well, you know, I mean, I'm listening to this, and actually, it brings up the previous points also. I mean, I just think writing is just so hard, and whether it's fiction, and I've never written poetry, or journalism, which is what I've been doing for the last decade, it's so to really create real art takes all the concentration and just painful process. But then it's so beautifully rewarding, and because of that beauty, I am having to disagree with you. My first novel was called The Interpreter. It was all about translation and the impossibility of translation and having connotated meaning and literal meaning, that there's a huge gap. And I think I have a line in the book where interpreter, translator, is like a mathematician, and true solver knows 2 plus 2. I think something like 2 plus 2 has to mean a lot of things before ending up at 4. So it's that gap, 2 plus 2 and 4, there's a huge gap in there. So I think an interpreter, translator has to understand all that. But then, of course, when my book came out in Korean, you know, so I published in America in English. When it was translated to other languages, I couldn't verify any of those other languages, but Korean I could. And when I looked at it, it was just appalling, the translation. And the first line of the novel was actually, cigarette at 9 a.m. is a sure sign of desperation. That line was changed to, smoking cigarette in the morning is terrible. This is, and I just, of course, panicked. It took years before the book came out in Korean because I would just, every time I said, this is just not acceptable, so you can't publish it. So they had to do another draft with my help. I couldn't translate it because I think a true translator requires a real skill. And if my book had to come out with the first line that said smoking a cigarette in the morning is terrible, I'd rather not have that book be published.
But it is terrible, Suki.
I don't know, coffee and a cigarette in the morning could be quite nice.
I think it's an interesting point of also, once your work has been translated, does it affect you as a writer as you go forward? Because I know with my first novel, which was called The Pleasure Seekers, and it was questioning what is the good life and the nature of desire in a very Greek philosophical way. When I arrived in Italy, published by a very well-known house, Feltrinelli, the reporter said, so Ms. Doshi, tell me with the title, Il piacere non può aspettare, what it means. And I said, wait, are you talking about the same book that I've done? Because this translates into Pleasure Can't Wait, which makes it sound like a soft porn novel, you know. And I said, that's not my book. And so I think now when I'm writing my novel, I keep asking my Italian husband, wait, how do you translate that into Italian? Because I don't want my next book to have a weird title. So, you know.
Do you think, I'll ask Suki and Tishani. Suki, do you think the translator then is almost like your editor? Is that the relationship you have with them?
Well, I think the translator, well, because my Korean edition, and because it went through so much, and I think that when I was writing my book on it was called Interpreter, I actually took a job as a translator for a year to understand the process. And what I understood from that process, that it needed so much, you needed to understand the context, history, slangs, and also have a literary talent. If you're going to translate fiction, you have to be a good writer also. And you also not only have to understand one culture, but both cultures to do real justice to the writer's art. I mean, I think it's an incredible skill.
It's a bring out the various
Very
nuances as well in terms of different cultures. And Tishani, you've just described your experience with an Italian. Do you feel that the question I threw to Suki, the role of the translator is similar to the editor?
Of course, but it's a great luxury to be able to work with a translator in that deep way. And also, I think, as a writer, when you write the book, at least that's the feeling I had at the end of the novel after 8 years. I thought, thank God I never have to look at this thing again. But if you have to work with a translator, which means you don't escape it, it means you have to go back into that work again and again and again, when in fact, in your mind as a writer, you've moved on to the next project. So it's a very, I think as writers, we inhabit many time zones, and it's quite difficult. And the translation adds a layer to that, being disoriented effect. But if you have the luxury to work with a translator, then obviously that would be the best option, yeah.
Excellent. So,
I want to say something. I think it is very good for a writer to go through a translation of his work. The reason is that when we write, we take so many things for granted. And at the time of translation, when it really passes through that gate, we realize that how much of that was unnecessary. How much of that is we have taken for granted, which is hidden, which can't pass that gate. And you feel really helpless. And so what actually goes across is something, I won't say it is different, but it is something, what really is essence of the book, what really stays, can pass through that gate. And it's a big lesson for a writer, and in usage of words, use of languages, phrases, images, everything. I think I consider that as every writer must go through to make sure that it's a big lesson. It's a big hit, big blow. Will be a big blow to his arrogance.
But of course, both you and Anantamurthy were translated, but were equally fluent in the language into which you were translated. So you wrote in Kannada, or you write in your case in Kannada, but your English is just as good. You could have written it in English, and therefore you can see when the translator is going wrong. And I guess that's true of Suki in Korean. It's not always true of the rest of us in other languages. Though I dare say your title must have sold a lot more copies in Italy.
Yes, I think they knew what they were doing.
Exactly. But one of the things I did, Eric, I'm very proud of about almost 27, 28 years ago, was I discovered that my French publisher was only publishing in French novels that they had got from Indian writers in English. And I said, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense, because in any case, your readers are reading them in French. So why don't you translate Indian novels from Indian languages? Because surely, whether they were originally composed in English or in Kannada, they're still Indian novel. So they said, fine, but we can't get any, we can't understand these languages. So I said, okay, read even an inadequate translation in English, and then bring the book out in French. And they took up the challenge, and now they have a pretty substantial list of Indian novels in French. It seems to me that we can do some of this kind of stuff, that is, even if it's necessary to go through an intermediate language, that is easier for them to find translations from. Of course, today, 25 years later, I'm sure there are enough original Bengali speakers who can write French and original Kannada speakers who can write French and so on. So maybe that period is over, but at that time, they didn't have such people, and I think it was important to get Indian writing more of an international audience that it enjoyed, except those of us who wrote in English were able to get that audience more easily.
That's a good comment. I can see the clock is now at 7 minutes. Tishani will read an extract from her new collection, her new work, and then if we have time, we'll open up the floor to a few questions.
So this is the title poem, and it's called Girls Are Coming Out of the Woods. Girls are coming out of the woods, wrapped in cloaks and hoods, carrying iron bars and candles, and a multitude of scars collected on acres of premature grass and city buses, in temples and bars. Girls are coming out of the woods with panties tied around their lips, making such a noise, it's impossible to hear. Is the world speaking too? Is it really asking, what does it mean to give someone a proper resting? Girls are coming out of the woods, lifting their broken legs high, leaking secrets from unfastened thighs. All the lies whispered by strangers and swimming coaches and uncles, especially uncles who said spreading would be light and easy, who put bullets in their chests and fed their pretty faces to fire, who sucked the mud clean off their ribs and decorated their coffins with briar. Girls are coming out of the woods, clearing a ground to scatter their stories. Even those girls found naked in ditches and wells, those forgotten in neglected attics and buried in riverbeds like sediments from a different century. They've crawled their way out from behind the curtains of childhood, the silver pink weight of their bodies pushing against water, against the sad, feathered tarnish of remembrance. Girls are coming out of the woods the way birds arrive at morning windows, pecking and humming, until all you can hear is the smash of their minuscule hearts against glass, the bright desperation of sound, bashing, disappearing. Girls are coming out of the woods. They're coming. They're coming. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Tashani. That was truly beautiful, so moving. I'm joking slightly. So we've got 4 minutes, and we're going to open up the questions to the floor. Is there a mic floating around? Do you want to go first? Do you want to stand up so we can hear you? Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Hello. 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 Hello, my name is Leia. I'm from Berkeley, California.
Hold it really close.
Close.
Okay. In a world where our society values STEM more than arts and literature as more true, because it's more objective, data-driven, and analytical, etc., how do we shift the trajectory back towards a more inclusive, less isolated view of the world? How can we blend literature and technology for a better world?
Can you repeat just the last bit of the question? I don't think everyone heard that.
How can we blend literature and technology for a better world?
The last bit. Sure. I think I made this point yesterday. We had a conversation around table about publishing and independent magazines. And the struggle that we have certainly as a publisher and an editor, and it's something that Shashi and I go through every 2 years, I guess, is we also, aside from commissioning great writers like Vivek, Suki, and Tashani, we also have an open platform, an open submissions platform, in which we get, around 600 submissions a month. And really, the quality of that is maybe 2 to 5%. So I think in this age, it's really on the quality of the content that you produce, because we're in a digital age where everyone has the ability to just share their thoughts, whether it's social media or Twitter. I'm eating this pasta, you take a quick snap, you share it with the world. So really it's the quality of the content that you produce. Certainly from speaking as myself as a publisher and editor of a literary magazine. Shashi, do you have an alternative?
No, that's fine. I think we get one more question in before you run out of the
Yeah,
clock.
one more question. Do you want the guy in the glasses, third row at the back, on the left?
I'll request all of you to please settle down. Don't leave now. Don't interrupt the session. Leave after the session ends.
Yeah, so Mr. Shashi, you spoke about how you asked somebody, your publisher in France, that you would translate the books to English, Indian literature to English, and then they would translate it further to France. And as we spoke about, losing the essence or the quality of literature every time we translate it, don't you think multiple translations will in turn deteriorate the quality so much that it's better to not let that literature out and keep the actual essence of it?
It's a very good question, but I'll tell you what my calculation was. these are writers who are already denied, if you like, the kind of national and international prominence that writing in English gives you in India. Many of them don't tend to get known sufficiently beyond their own states, their own languages. And it seemed to me faintly absurd that here was, let's say, a French publisher, it's probably true of many other European languages, confining themselves to Indian writers whom they could quickly read in English and understand, but missing out on this vast sort of, iceberg, as it were, of Indian writing, which they felt they had no access to. So I thought better for these writers to get something of an audience, even through a medium of going through one language already, than to miss out on the audience altogether. I might add that I agree entirely with what Suki said earlier, that the best translations are from people who are equally comfortable in both languages. That is, that if you're translating, say, an English language book into French, you ought to be pretty much equally fluent in English and French, but French should be your more instinctive language, because that's a language in which you're writing for the reader. Very often, unfortunately, many Indian books are translated badly in English. A great exception is Vivek's extraordinary work, which has been beautifully translated. But if you look at books translated in the 60s and 70s, I'd wager you'd find 8 or 9 bad translations for every one good one, just in terms of the fact that the person writing it uses clunky English, because really they're translating from their first language into English rather than into their first language. You see what I'm saying? So there are all of these challenges. I mentioned that in the earlier answer to the question. I still felt honestly that give these folks a break. Today, as I was saying to Eric, there probably are many, many more people who are equally comfortable in, say, Bengali and French, or in Kannada and French, who are doing French books in France. But that may not be true so much, I don't know, in Romanian or Norwegian. Why should we deny the Indian writer the opportunity of appearing in Romanian and Norwegian, however flawed the process may be?
I think it's denying any writer this outreach, but Tishani, you had a
Yeah, I mean,
answer.
it just comes back to your first thing about the walls, because I think the whole idea of trapping language, it's crazy, because language will always find a kind of expression somewhere. Some person is going to translate your work, maybe without your permission even. And poets do it all the time. It's a very generous society where, we translate in other languages. But personally, for myself, I can't imagine having been a writer without Dostoevsky and Neruda and Rilke, and I'm so bad with languages that I obviously would not have been able to have Russian, German, and Spanish. So I'm happy for the translations, because they've made me the writer that I am.
Viv.
I first read Vaikam Muhammad Bashir, the great Malayalam writer, in a very bad translation. Despite that, I loved his work so much that I went after everything and read whatever was available in English and Kannada and in Hindi. So I think even in bad translation, a good writer survives. Little bit. It may not be, but
That's
little
a
bit.
good point. Yeah.
A big round of applause for Shashi Tharoor, Suki Kim, Tishani Doshi, Vivek Shanbag, and Eric Akoto for these beautiful sessions. Thank you so very much. Thank you so much for being so